Today we're going to talk about some terms that can be confused with one another or used interchangeably: documentary and propaganda. We're going to set out some definitions of terminology that we'll be using for this class, just so we're all on the same page. The question is, which one is the good one and which one is the bad one? And the answer, of course, is neither. First off, what is a documentary film? We tend to think of a documentary not only as true and factual, but also somehow more important or virtuous than entertainment films. A documentary in its simplest form is simply a visual document, a photographic record of something that happened. Once editing and narration are added to the image to construct a narrative, the film begins to tell a story, represent a point of view, or to steer the viewer to a certain conclusion. It's no longer just a document. It's a constructed narrative, which may or may not be giving a full or accurate representation of the subject. Nature documentaries in particular use footage shot out of sequence, manipulated, edited, and narrated to tell an exciting, sympathetic, or anthropomorphic story, all of which move the document further away from pure documentation. Now let's consider propaganda. Propaganda has the reputation of being fake news put out by the powerful to mislead the gullible. Certainly, repressive political regimes such as the Nazis and the Soviet Union were masters of the art using propaganda to mislead and manipulate the general populace. But what is propaganda? Propagate just means to spread and plant. So spreading information about disease prevention, voting rights, or suicide prevention is helpful, not harmful. Governments, charities, and non-profit social service agencies all produce propaganda that is useful and truthful. We often call these public service announcements. Of course, when it comes to controversial subjects like climate change, political profiles, and LGBT issues, one person's fact-filled documentary is another person's twisted propaganda. This is where careful, educated analysis is needed to separate fact from fiction. For the purposes of this class, we are including all non-fiction films in this section because the term documentary is simplistic and misleading. There really is no such thing as an unbiased recording of facts. All films are propaganda in one way or another. Before we talk more about the different kinds of non-fiction films, I want to remind you that you should always be wearing your historian hat, and that means remembering to consider the source. Specifically, when can a film be considered a primary source? Even fictional films can include elements of primary source material, if you're thinking like a historian. For now, let's get back to defining our terms for this section of the course. Narrative versus non-narrative film. Non-narrative just shows pictures. The earliest films in the 1880s were what you would call non-narrative films. Early film photographers simply filmed street scenes, or famously a train pulling into the station. Narrative film tells a story. This can be fiction or nonfiction. Editing makes almost every film into some sort of narrative. The very first narrative film was a comedy. In 1895, the film The Water Hose, a man is watering the lawn with a garden hose. Someone steps on the hose and stops the water. The gardener looks at the hose, and the prankster steps off, and the gardener gets sprayed in the face. A gag that still works today. To many people, today people use narrative film to mean fictional, but even non-fiction films have narratives or stories, so think carefully about the use of terms narrative and non-narrative when writing about documentary films. Better to use the terms fiction and non-fiction. Here are some other terms you should consider. Educational. What does educational mean? We tend to think of educational films as things you watched in school or on PBS. Nature films and science shows are visual productions that seem closest to reading a nonfiction book. Of course, anything can be educational if you learn something. But we tend to use the term educational film if it was specifically to provide information over entertainment, and especially if it's aimed at young people. Editorial. Think of an editorial films like an opinion piece in the newspaper or a blog. Editorial films are made to promote points of view. Analyzing an editorial film requires perspective and research. Who made it? Why was it made? What is their point of view? What idea are they trying to promote? For instance, this is a nonfiction or documentary film which argues that all religion is stupid. Cinema verite, meaning truthful cinema, was a movement popular in the 1960s. The idea was to simply point the camera and record what happens with as little interaction or influence on the subject as possible. While this movement did produce some important films, it is not possible to capture reality just as it is, because every decision about where and when to point the camera, what to include, what to edit out in the final project, are all artistic decisions. Only unedited live stream technology comes close, and that too is limited by camera angles. You can never really know what's going on behind the camera. Which brings us, of course, to reality TV. Keeping Up with the Kardashians, World's Deadliest Catch, The Bachelor, these shows purport that they are simply filming unscripted action as it happens, a modern cinema verite. Can you consider these records to be non-fiction? In reality, these shows are heavily edited, often scripted, shot out of sequence, and the subjects are performing for the cameras. This is not documentary. It's not even nonfiction. While you are analyzing nonfiction sources, keep an eye out for the following. Narration. Do the images speak for themselves, or do they need to be explained? Experts. Are they credited? Are they credible? Anthropomorphism, which is using editing or narration to make animals or inanimate objects seem more like humans. Makes the story more compelling and relatable, but is it scientifically accurate? And dynamic editing. Documentary filmmaker Ken Burns developed a photo scanning effect with a moving camera that makes still images come alive. This makes static images more engaging, but keep an eye out for other types of manipulation such as speeding up or slowing down video, adding music which makes the subject seem comic or dangerous, or using sound bites that distort facts. As you work through all the different assignments in this course, remember to think about what you are seeing and reading with a critical and doubtful mindset. Consider that you are being entertained, and when you are being informed, and when you are being misled, even in small ways. When does accuracy and intent matter? And when is it all just for fun?